Salutations and welcome, horse racing fans. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and this is the Win Place Show, a podcast devoted to all aspects of horse racing and handicapping that is proudly part of the Amalfi Media Network. Now, today we're going to be casting our eyes a little bit towards the future, the very near future, and the Breeders' Cup in November, and specifically taking a look at the 5 Breeders' Cup Juvenile fields, which are, of course, the TVG Juvenile, the Juvenile Fillies, the Juvenile Turf, the Juvenile Fillies Turf, and the Juvenile Turf Sprint. Now, earlier, back in mid-September, I previewed the Breeders' Cup Classic races for the 3-year-old and up division, and you can check that out and get a link to that in the episode notes. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can also click the link that should be appearing on the screen right about now. So before we get into previewing the juvenile fields, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who is following, downloading, and sharing the Win Place Show on the podcast platform of their choice, and also sharing on social media with friends and fellow horse racing fans. I really do appreciate all of the support. And I'm been a little surprised that when we launched the podcast, we've actually seen our YouTube numbers increase. I was worried that that would go the other direction, but a lot of you have discovered our YouTube channel as well, and that's wonderful. And you can find that linked in the episode notes. And since this is a Breeders' Cup episode, I wanted to let you know that we have some really exciting interviews and content coming up for the podcast and the YouTube channel for Breeders' Cup week, that first week of November. Of course, we'll have the full previews with picks and handicapping advice for all of the races on Friday, all of the races on Saturday. We'll come at you right after the races are done with recaps and reaction. But even ahead of that, we're going to have some great interviews with prominent figures in the horse racing industry, as well as a fun top 10 Breeders' Cup moment episode. So we have a lot of things planned. You don't want to miss it. Finally, make sure to check out all we have to offer on Amalfi Media by going to amalfimedia.com, and follow me on Twitter and keep pace of the latest news in horse racing at the handle @FailedToMenace. Okay, so let's dive into the juvenile races for the Breeders' Cup, and before we get to the races, start by explaining why I love talking about juvenile races. Because for those of you who have been listening to my podcast, watching my video for a while, you know that I always get excited when I talk about 2-year-old races. And that's a little odd because I know there are some people, I know, for instance, Caleb from On the Wrong Lead, which is another great horse racing podcast. I know Caleb does not like usually spending a lot of time talking about 2-year-old races. I love talking about 2-year-old races. And I think a lot of it has to do with where I came from and where I grew up and my sports fandom. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm a Philadelphia sports fan through and through. And I'm sorry if that offended anyone by me saying that. But listen, if you are a Philadelphia sports fan, things rarely ever go your way. And you always have a wait till next year mentality. And that mentality bleeds over, and you get more excited about, in baseball, the minor leagues, in the NFL and NBA and NHL, you get excited about the draft. You get excited about the kids. You get excited about the potential. You're never focused on reality because reality is always disappointing. You're focused on what could be in the future, the potential. That's what's so exciting. And I think the promise of potential, at least in my eyes, is always more exciting than reality and what things and what horses and what people eventually become. And while I wouldn't say any of the older horses in this year's Breeders' Cup are disappointing, far from it. This is an amazing Breeders' Cup Classic field we have. There is something eternally fulfilling in my eyes and exciting about seeing the new horses that I'm going to talk about today burst onto the scene. Well, the other piece of news, which is time sensitive to this middle of October as I'm recording this, is that the Breeders' Cup just over the weekend announced that they will allow Bob Baffert horses to run in this year's Breeders' Cup, despite him having several pending and current suspensions in other states, most notably New York and Kentucky. But all of his horses can be entered into the Breeders' Cup, but must submit to additional testing at his expense. Obviously, there's been, I think, a lot of noise on both sides of this argument. Some people saying let him run his horses, don't punish the horses for his misdeeds. I think there are a lot of people who see Bob Baffert as being a symbol of things that are kind of wrong with the sport, and see a lot of conflict of interest with the Breeders' Cup decision and the people who have association with the Baffert. So I don't know if there's a middle ground in this argument. You kind of find yourself in one camp or the other. But that said, as it relates to this interview, the Baffert horses are in, and that's important because they're going to have a real impact on some of these fields. So let's start off with the biggest field, and let's take a look at the TVG Juvenile, which is 1.6 miles on dirt for 2-year-olds, obviously. All of these are. And this is a loaded field, and it should be pointed out that some of these horses may scratch. We're going to talk about some of the horses that may pull out in this field, but these are the horses that have accumulated the sufficient amount of points to be eligible for the Breeders' Cup. We've talked about this before, that you have to accumulate a certain number of points to be eligible or win a win-and-you're-in race. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot more win-and-you're-in races for the older division because those races take all year. On the juvenile side, a lot of the win-and-you're-in races take place really the last 2 or 3 months of the racing schedule because this is the time the 2-year-olds are finally rounding into form. And so, therefore, there just aren't that many win-and-you're-in races for the juvenile division. That said, let's run through this field, and I'll mention the qualifications of how this horse got to be in this race, as well as some of the early odds that they face. Now, not all the horses have odds. That's something which some of the early line betting like Bovada is providing for a few of the horses. So let's start off with the win-and-you're-in horses. That was Corniche, trained by Bob Baffert, who finished first at the American Pharoah Stakes, which is grade 1. Then Jack Christopher, the Chad Brown horse, also a win-and-you're-in, who finished first at the Champagne Stakes. And then just this last weekend, we saw Rattle and Roll, trained by Ken McPeak, punch his ticket to the Breeders' Cup by getting first at Claiborne Breeders' Futurity, which was a grade 1. And then the other horses in the field did not necessarily win a win-and-you're-in, but have accumulated a sufficient amount of points based upon their finishes in other races that were not associated with the Breeders' Cup win-and-you're-in. And so that includes Gunnet, which is trained by Steve Asmussen, Wit, that's trained by Todd Pletcher, Papacap, trained by Mark Cassey, Double Thunder, trained by Todd Pletcher, Pinehurst, trained by Bob Baffert, Command Performance, trained by Todd Pletcher, American Experiment, trained by Steve Asmussen, Classic Causeway, trained by Brian Lynch, Kevin's Folly, trained by Tom Amos, and then finally Oviatt Class, trained by Keith DeSormo. And right now, the betting odd favorite is Jack Christopher, Chad Brown's horse, who won the Champagne Stakes, going off at 5-2, followed closely by Corniche, Baffert's horse, who very impressively won the American Pharoah Stakes. Rattle and Roll was there at 7-1. Now, here's the thing. Ken McPeak just came out recently and said that Rattle and Roll may not end up going to the Breeders' Cup. So that's a horse that, even though I mentioned it, won the win-and-you're-in race, may not actually run at Del Mar, may be looking to run at Churchill Downs later in November. Among the other horses that were not win-and-you're-in, there are a couple that I think are particularly telling. I really like Pinehurst, which is one of the other Bob Baffert horses that won the Del Mar Futurity, which was a grade 1. And I also really like Gunnet, and I think it's hard not to like Gunnet. Gunnet's the Steve Asmussen horse that won the Hopeful Stakes up at Saratoga. Those are two horses that just show a lot of guts. And I think that's something to keep in mind with this 2-year-old classic field. Corniche and Jack Christopher have looked amazing in the races that they have run. They have looked dominant. They have put away the fields with class and by dozens of lengths combined. So they are looking unbeatable. The thing is, now they're going to face up against other really good horses from other parts of the country. And we're stretching out to 1.16 miles. And they're going to get pushed. And they're going to get pushed for early speed. These horses are not all going to get great trips. That's one of the things that always stands out to me, is that most of these 2-year-olds have gotten great trips and aren't used to adversity necessarily. And I tend to really value horses that have shown some grit, some perseverance, have fought through adversity, can come from off the pace, can deal with not breaking well necessarily, and still coming back and catching up. So I think there's something to be said. So while Corniche and Jack Christopher are appropriately the early favorites, I don't think you could just assume it's a 2-horse race. I think there's a lot of horses in this field that can really run. I think Witt's another horse that has faded a little bit over the summer, had an amazing Sanford Stakes early in the summer, just looked incredible, the move he made, but he's had some gait issues, hasn't broken that well. He does persevere. He does keep running, and he does still finish on the board in those races as he's stretched out, but he hasn't replicated that Sanford Stakes effort. Like I said, Gunnett and Pinehurst both have shown a lot of class, and they've just shown a lot of grit and determination. I like that. I like to see a horse that can dig in, and those are the horses that I think are going to end up doing well because, again, not everybody's going to get a good trip this time around. This is going to be a huge field. We don't know post positions yet, so there's a lot of unknown. There's also a horse I'll mention very quickly, Oviatt Class, the last horse I mentioned, who finished third at the American Pharoah Stakes. If I was into betting futures, I would put a fair amount of money on Oviatt Class to win the Belmont because this horse can run for days. And this horse is bred for distance. And he kind of has a mind that bird running style where he comes from way off the pace and has this incredible closing kick. I think he's got to refine that a little bit and as he continues to go up in class, but he's a horse that I'm really intrigued by. So really impressive juvenile field. So let's transition and take a look at the field for the Juvenile Fillies. And this is another really stacked card and a stacked field with a lot of potential entries. And again, these are all of the horses that have gotten the necessary number of points qualified through Breeders' Cup races. Now, that said, in terms of grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, now that said, if you see horses drop out of the field, it's possible that other horses could come in based upon other resume factors, earnings, etc., could enter this field. So this is by no means the final definitive list of the horses that will be in the field, but certainly a pretty good sense of who's going to be in this field. So the Juvenile Fillies is also 1.16 miles on dirt, obviously just for the fillies and just for the ladies. And we'll start off at the top with a few of the Win You're In horses. Echo Zulu, trained by Steve Asmussen. Juju's Map, trained by Brad Cox. Ain't Easy, trained by Philip D'Amato. And Hidden Connection, trained by Brett Calhoun. Those are the 4 Win You're In horses that qualified in that way, and those are among the favorites. Then you have the remaining horses, which is still a significant number. Grace Adler, another Bob Baffert horse. Saucy Lady T, trained by James Chapman. Dance to the Music, trained by Mark Glatt. Distinctly Possible, trained by Chad Brown. Elm Drive, trained by Philip D'Amato. Gerrymander, trained by Chad Brown. Tarabi, trained by Sherry DeVoe. Amo Ray, trained by Todd Pletcher. Bicameral, trained by Richard Baltus. Ida, another Bob Baffert entry. And then finally, Electric Ride, trained by John Sadler. And you can see these horses have largely run against each other at races like the Frizette, the Spinaway, the Darley Alcibiades, the Chandelier Stakes, the Pocahontas, etc., the Sorrento Stakes, the Del Mar Debutante. These are the kind of the circuit that these fillies have been running on and going up against each other. But at the very top, you have Echo Zulu, who is the early odds-on favorite at 8-5. Juju's Map, second at 5-2. And then you have a little bit of a gap to Ain't Easy at 9-2 and Hidden Connection at 6-1. But again, those are the early odds that are being posted by Bovada. Nothing official has been released yet as it relates to the race. But Echo Zulu has just looked incredibly good. I mean, this is quite the horse. This is a horse that won both the Frizette and the Spinaway. It's the only 2-year-old that's won 2 Grade 1 races. And people are already talking. I know there are a lot of people on horse racing Twitter who have been talking about, is this horse good enough to run against the boys? Is this horse good enough to do a Rachel Alexandra and run against the boys? Because this horse seems to have just an incredible tank and a lot of speed. And so very, very impressive horse. That said, Juju's Map, the Brad Cox horse who just won the Darley Alcibiades in Keeneland, looked great in that race. That's a horse that also has a lot of speed, can really run. Ain't easy in Hidden Curriculum. Don't sleep on either of them. Hidden Connection, I should say, in particular, I really like. Now, some of the other horses I'll mention, the Bob Baffert horse, Grace Adler, the bloom has kind of come off the rose a little bit on Grace Adler. Had a little bit of a wit situation that I just talked about, had regressed the last time out. And so that's possible that you see, that was at the Chandelier Stakes. She, I think, finished 5th in that race. So that's something where a little bit of an issue when we stepped up in distance, stepped up in class, didn't necessarily perform that well, had won a lot of things before that, but had not placed particularly well in that particular field that day. And so she's like I said, a very good horse though. And we'll see if she is able to progress and bounce back from that loss. Sometimes that's what a horse needs. Elm Drive, another horse that kind of fits that field, the Phil D'Amato horse, won the Sorrento Stakes, which was a grade 2 competition, but really has struggled at the grade 1 level for these 2-year-old fillies. So that's another one to keep an eye on. I liked Elm Drive at that grade 2. I love that performance in the Sorrento Stakes, but just has not been able to translate that in some other ways. And then very quickly, I'll just say, 2 horses that are after my heart, because for those of you who don't know, and I don't publicize this and I don't go on rants about this on Twitter or anything like that, but I was a political science professor for about 10 years before I started kind of moving into other aspects of higher education in my current job. But, I love politics. I love talking about politics in person with you. I won't bore you with it on the internet or on social media or on these podcasts, but gerrymander and bicameral. I mean, come on, those are great political names. So as a political scientist, I'm rooting for gerrymander and bicameral. And they're both very good horses. I mean, gerrymander finished quite a ways off at the Frizette against Echo Zulu, but certainly a very good horse. Chad Brown, great trainer. Richard Baltus, the same thing with bicameral. Actually had, I think, a surprising showing at the Del Mar Debutante. So this is a horse that could be progressing nicely. So those are kind of the juvenile fillies that we, took a look at here. And I will say that is a top-heavy field. I think Echo Zulu is just so much the best in that field. But it's all about progression. So we'll see how it plays out. Now let's move to the Juvenile Turf. And this is another really loaded field. And one of the things I'll say about the Juvenile Turf is, for those of you who've been following closely, you know that there were several win-and-you're-in races for this division. But I'm not going to mention several names in this particular field because a lot of the European horses are choosing not to come over. And so, therefore, this is a slightly smaller field, still a pretty good size, but a slightly smaller field. And we'll start off with Albar, trained by Charles Appleby, British horse, actually, who won a win-and-you're-in. And then Tis the Bomb, another Ken McPeak horse, who also just won this past weekend at the Bourbon Stakes at Keeneland. The other horses in the field are Annapolis, trained by Todd Pletcher, Grafton Street, trained by Mark Cassey, Portfolio Company, trained by Chad Brown, Coinage, trained by Mark Cassey, Degree of Risk, trained by Owen Hardy, Slipstream, trained by Christoph Clement, who finished first at the Futurity, and then Stolen Base, trained by Mike Maker, Limited Liability, which is Shug McGahee's horse, and then finally Credibility, also trained by Mark Cassey. So you see a lot of Mark Cassey entries. In fact, you see 3 in this particular race. So you do see some of the same trainers repeat themselves, and you've seen that in some of the other races too. What is interesting about this particular field is that Slipstream actually won a race in the Futurity that qualified him for the sprint. It looks like Slipstream's probably going to run the mile turf, but it's possible that some of these horses decide to drop down to the turf sprint. That's obviously a choice that trainers make. They can move this horses around a little bit here. So we'll see. This is a field that is, I don't think, fully set yet. I would expect to see a few other horses. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are some horses that may not have accumulated points because of their finishes in graded stakes competition, but they may still have the resume in terms of earnings, in terms of winning other races outside of graded stakes races that will qualify them for this field. So I have a feeling, in particular, the juvenile turf field is still a little unsettled. But that said, Albar, the Charles Appleby horse, is quite dominant and showed a lot of class, I think, in that summer stakes. So we'll see how that plays out. I really like Annapolis, the Todd Pletcher horse. You don't usually associate Todd Pletcher with turf, but Annapolis is a really good horse, and I really was impressed by that performance at the Pilgrim Stakes a little ways back. But like I said, all of these horses are particularly strong and have been kind of running against each other in the Pilgrim, the Summer Stakes, the Bourbon Stakes, and so that's something just to keep in mind. So that is the juvenile turf. Now, let's go to the Juvenile Fillies Turf. And here we actually do see a few more Europeans. And this is, again, a mile on turf for fillies. And these European horses that you see in this field or that you hear about in this field, these are horses that largely have come over and have run in the United States this year. So they were bred overseas, but were brought over either to Canada, in the case of the Wild Beauty, who's one of the horses I'll mention, or into the United States with some of the Chad Brown horses that I'll mention as well. So this is another really full field because we don't have any European scratches yet. And so let's take a look at this. So it's Wild Beauty, trained by Charles Appleby, California Angel, who just qualified this last weekend. And I got a lot of things to say about that horse, trained by George Leonard III in the Jessamine Stakes. And then Hello You, an Irish horse trained by David Loughnane. And those are the three win and you're in horses for that particular division. But the other horses are all really strong. You have Pizza Bianca, trained by Christophe Clement, Sail By, trained by Leah Gravmati. You have Bubble Rock, trained by Brad Cox, Diamond Wow, trained by Patrick Bianconi, Eminent Victor, Chad Brown horse. Then you have Kinchin, an Irish horse, also trained by Chad Brown, Gal in a Rush, Christophe Clement. And then McCulloch, a British horse, trained by Chad Brown, Turner Loose, trained by Brad Cox, and then finally Mystic Eyes, trained by Todd Pletcher. And I'll start by saying California Angel was a great story. That was a great story. It was a 17-1 long shot that ended up winning the Jessamine Stakes and punching that ticket to the win and you're in to the Breeders' Cup. So was thrilled to see that. And then George Leonard III. I mean, listen, if you're watching this on YouTube, you know I like fashion. I got a little bit of a look. I like to dress up. I like to wear my little cap for these videos, things like that. George Leonard III, everybody should aspire to look like George Leonard III. He's got this big old Stetson. He's got this gray beard. He's got the jeans and the tie and suit though that go along with it. He looks good. He 10 out of 10 in terms of fashion for George Leonard III. But he had a lot of faith in California Angel. And interestingly, California Chrome has turned into a very effective sire for turf horses. So I was not surprised. California Angel was a horse I really liked in that race and played on a couple different cards and in a few different fantasy games like Stable Duel. And so California Angel is a really good horse that I like quite a bit there. The other horses in the field, listen, it's, we'll see. I think it's probably going to be an Appleby victory. I really like Wild Beauty. She showed me a lot at Woodbine not that long ago at the Not a Lot of Mistakes. And I talked earlier about showing grit. That race did not go the way Wild Beauty initially wanted. Had to come from off the pace. Didn't have the greatest trip. Wasn't the jockey's fault, but just didn't have the greatest trip. And dug down, came back late, and won. And not only won, beat Eminent Victor, the Chad Brown horse, and so, showed a lot of, like I said, grit, determination, beat Pizza Bianca, the Christophe Clement horse as well. So beat some really good horses that will also face in this field. So I like seeing that progression. Obviously, that's what 2-year-old races are all about. It's about getting better. And that's why handicapping these is not so much about looking at the past as much as progression and looking towards the future. Horses at this age, if you're basing how they're going to do based off of how they did 3-4 months ago, good luck with that. a lot of times you really have to look at how are they progressing? How is their bodies filling out? How are they learning to run? How are they learning to break from the gate? How are they learning to take jockeying effectively? How are they being trained? I mean, it is all about progression here. And this is also why we sometimes don't see great juveniles become great older horses. Sometimes horses are just mature earlier. And then the rest of their cohort, the rest of their year kind of catches up to them at that 3-year-old level. If you go back and look at the Juvenile Classic winners, they don't translate to the Kentucky Derby winners all the time. Now, Essential Quality is a pretty good horse, but a lot of these horses, it doesn't always translate. And you don't always see them come back as 3-year-olds as effective because the other horses in their cohort, the other horses in their crop have caught up. And you're going to potentially see the same thing here. So these 2-year-olds, they're still filling out. They're still getting better. There's a lot to see. And that's what makes it exciting for me, I think. So let's talk about this last field. And this is the smallest field, the Juvenile Turf Sprint, which is only 5 furlongs on turf. And right now, there are only 4 horses that have actually qualified through the Breeders' Cup for this race. Now, there's going to be a lot more than 4 horses in this field. But Averly Jane was a win-in-your-in horse trained by Wesley Ward, one-timer, also trained by Larry Ravelli. And then you have Run Curtis Run, trained by Mike Maker, and Biz Biz Buzz, trained by Michael Trombetta. This is where I mentioned Slipstream could come down to the sprint division. You could see a few other horses from that turf, the juvenile turf, come down to this division, to the sprint level. I wouldn't even be shocked if some of the Juvenile Fillies maybe even came down to the sprint division. At the 2-year-old level, a lot of times the fillies are as fast or faster than the boys. So, it would be interesting to see whether or not you see any of that coming down, any of the girls just decide to run down at this level. We'll see. Bottom line is there's going to be a lot of other horses coming into this field. I think you can expect to see horses like Brandon's My Lawyer or Zane's Claudette, other good turf sprint young horses enter this field. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. That said, Averly Jane looked really, really good at Keeneland in the Indian Summer Stakes, and got a lot of people saying, well, that's one of the horses I'm going to single on my tickets at the Breeders' Cup weekend because I just know that horse is going to win. I mean, Averly Jane did look much the best. And again, that just happened a couple weeks ago. So this horse is in top form going into the Breeders' Cup. Well, listen, folks, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this Breeders' Cup Juvenile preview to hold you over until Friday, November 5th. And remember that we'll continue to have weekly race previews of weekend races from around the country. And this week, just to let you know, we have a Friday episode coming out, and we're going to be headed right up the road from where I live to Laurel Park, and we're going to preview the Maryland Million Day. It's always a lot of fun to go to the local tracks and preview some of the races that may not get national attention all the time. So that's what I'll be doing. And then we'll also have great Breeders' Cup episodes with interviews and special topics ahead of my picks and handicapping episodes for that huge, huge weekend in the sport. Remember, the best place to get all of this is amalfimedia.com. Continue to follow, download, rate, review, and share the Win Play Show on the podcast platform of your choice. Finally, just a reminder to subscribe to the Win Play Show on YouTube, which is linked in the episode notes. Follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailToMenace. And check out amalfimedia.com for all of the great horse racing content you need to get you through the Breeders' Cup and beyond. Until next time, friends, I'm Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and prosperous day at the races and reminding you that it's now post time.